Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single episode and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Ron Granieri, professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and podcast editor of the War Room. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Every day, an intelligence officer visits with the president and other senior leaders of the United States government to offer the President's Daily Brief, or PDB. This up-to-date rundown of the most important issues facing the world sets the tone for the policymakers' day and is the subject of a great deal of conjecture as subsequent scholars and analysts try to figure out what a president generally knows and when the president knows it. So who puts the PDB together? What gets in it? How is it delivered? What role does it play in policymaking? Fortunately, for those of us here at A Better Peace and for all of you out there listening, we have a colleague at the U.S. Army War College who knows the answers to many of these questions and is joining us today to discuss the Presidential Daily Brief. And that person is Ms. Stephanie Sellers. Stephanie Sellers currently serves as the Central Intelligence Agency representative to the U.S. Army War College and the General Walter Beadle-Smith Chair of National Intelligence Studies. Ms. Sellers has 27 years of experience in the U.S. government as an intelligence educator, tradecraft facilitator, analytic manager, military analyst, science and technology analyst, and missile system engineer. From 2018 to 2019, Ms. Sellers served as the PDB briefer to the Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And if that weren't enough, before joining the Central Intelligence Agency, Ms. Sellers served as a Department of the Navy civilian aerospace engineer, where she directed program operations, developed hardware, and conducted tests on reentry vehicles for the Navy's Trident submarine-launched ballistic missile system, which means Ms. Sellers is not only an international woman of mystery, but also a rocket scientist. And we are delighted to have her with us today. Welcome to A Better Peace, Stephanie Sellers.
Thank you, Ron. It's great to be here.
So, Stephanie, how did you end up at the CIA?
So, as you mentioned in your introduction, I started my career out at the Navy working on Trident ballistic missile systems. I followed that by starting in a master's program at George Washington University, and I became friends with another student there. Mm-hmm. And so she found out what I did and said, hey, here's where I work, the Central Intelligence Agency. Would you ever like to work there? And I said,
so are they allowed to say that directly, or do they have to be vague and say, I work for an important agency?
No, she was able to say that to me directly. And she asked if I ever wanted to apply there, if they were ever hiring. And I thought, what is a rocket scientist going to do at the agency? But I said, that sounds really fun. So I thought, sure, please let me know, right? And after 9/11, she told me there were vacancies on her team and asked if I wanted to put in an application. And so I said, absolutely. And I gave her, at this point, I was working on some doctoral classes. And I gave her my resume, a little bit of my master's thesis, and got an interview. And as they say, the rest is history. So I was a part of the big post 9/11 hiring surge at the agency. And I've loved it. I've done some work with the Air Force in the meantime, but other than that, I've been at the CIA, and it's absolutely wonderful.
Interesting. So in other words, or one could say, right, since then the rest is redacted, right?
Yes, the rest is redacted.
So I want to talk about the PDB, but I'm also curious, how do you go from working for the agency to being a briefer? So I'll let you choose which order you want to take those questions, sort of, the history of the PDB, but also your history as becoming a PD briefer.
Okay. I think I'll take the briefer part first.
Okay.
So that same colleague of mine, when I came into the agency about 15 months later, it's a long process, she was a PDB briefer for one of the customers that we had. And I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. I really didn't know a lot about intelligence before I went into the CIA because I had worked my career in missile systems in the DoD. And so I thought, wow, that's really sounds like a fascinating job. And so they offered shadowing opportunities. So I said, okay, I kind of shadowed up there to see, not with the actual briefing, just to come up and see what it's like a night or day in the life of a briefer. And so it kind of became one of my, bucket list jobs to become briefer to Secretary of Defense. And I didn't really think I would ever do that job. And I didn't know how I would get there or what I would do to get there. But that's kind of how I got interested in the position. And then I'm a Naval War College graduate. So when I came back from the Naval War College, I landed in an office with an incredible manager. And I've had many, many incredible managers at the agency. He was so good at developing people. And he said, I know that, you love doing analytic methodology, but I also know that you have some other longer term career goals. And, let's talk about that. And I said, well, I really want to be a PDB briefer. Mm-hmm. So I actually interviewed to be the vice president's briefer. So we can talk a little bit about how briefers are selected. Basically, when I was being selected, you applied for a position. So vice president briefer position came open, and I went in to my boss's office because he, called me and he said, hey, you're going to want to look at this opportunity. And when I did, I said, oh no, I can't be the vice president's briefer. And he said, why not? And I said, I don't have any experience for that. I mean, that's policy. I can't, and I was really nervous. And he said, well, of course you can. And I said, I really want to be SecDef's briefer. And he said, but you could do that in your sleep, which I disagree with, by the way. It's a very challenging job. But his point was I'd worked with or for the military my entire career. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, do you want to be comfortable or do you want to be challenged?
Oh.
And I thought, oh. So I applied.
There's only one answer to that question.
There is only one answer. But I didn't get the job.
Well.
But the phone call came, about maybe 6 weeks after I applied. And the head of the PDB staff at the time said to me, sorry, you didn't get the position. But we would really like you to take the position to brief Deputy Secretary of Defense and Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And I thought, that sounds great. And so I took the position. I floated up with the Deputy Secretary when he became acting secretary and stayed on a little bit to another transition to a secretary and did about 14 months in the job. Gotcha.
So going back to the history of the PDB, is it the same brief no matter which office is being briefed? Or does are there substantive differences depending on the rank of the person being briefed?
So the PDB itself is one package. Mm-hmm. It's the exact same thing to every customer that the president gets. Yeah. And so the pieces that go in the PDB will go into, cabinet level members, NSC, whoever the president deems that he wants to have on his.
And that's the president's decision who gets to see the presidential daily brief.
Absolutely. Yep. So the president gets to decide who gets the PDB. And historically, if you'd like, I can go back to the question of where did the PDB come from? What's the history of this?
Yeah.
So the practice of providing daily intelligence updates began with World War II. There was a known need for intelligence, up-to-date, timely, critical, strategic as well, not just tactical, of course. And so the concept of the PDB came about in 1946 with President Truman and evolved through formats such as one of my favorite acronyms, the PICKLE. That's the President's Intelligence Checklist. That was President Kennedy's version of the PDB. But officially it was introduced in 1964. That was under President Johnson. And that's kind of what we see the format as today. And again, it changes, from president to president. But it's really been critical in shaping U.S. foreign policy and national security, and particularly during events like the Cuban Missile Crisis and 9/11. Sure. And it's not just a daily intelligence report or analysis, but it really is a historical record of how different administrations perceived and responded to global challenges. So it really gives a unique insight into the decision-making processes at the highest level of the government.
Because I guess it would reflect the priorities of the president, right? If the president, or let's say it would reflect the situation in the world, right? If the United States is heavily involved, say, I don't know, let me pick a place at random, in the Persian Gulf, or say in Iraq, right? Chances are good that a lot of the president's PDB on any given day will probably deal with the Persian Gulf or Iraq.
Yeah, so the PDB has a variety of different topics in it. Certainly, there's going to be up-to-date or, I guess, pressing or critical or current issues. Yeah. But it also has a lot of strategic issues in it. And what I always like to say when I was a briefer is, we want to absolutely make sure we're meeting the priorities of the president and of his cabinet, of the policymakers of the United States. Sure. But we also want to tell them what they may not know to ask, meaning we may see a piece of intelligence that is new and it's something that hasn't been reported on. And we want to make sure we get that in front of the policymakers as quick as we can. And so sometimes sometimes the tasking is driven by the intelligence community, or the pieces are driven by the intelligence community, and sometimes by the policymakers, by the president, or anyone who gets the PDB. Can reach out to the intelligence community, typically through their briefers, and say, hey, I would like to see a piece on XYZ.
Right. That's what I was wondering is that every daily brief can essentially feed future daily briefs if at the end in the conversation the briefer has with the principal can say, that's really interesting. I think I need to hear more about that. Or can you follow up on that?
Absolutely. Yes. So, and that can come in the form of just a simple answer, via email to either the customer or through their staff. It could be another PDB, another day, or it could be something a little bit longer, a little bit more strategic. And when I say longer, I guess both temporally as well as a longer piece. The PDBs are typically about a page to a page and a half. Right.
That's what I was thinking. So to boil down whatever's going on in the world into a page or a page and a half, that's got to be a little difficult. And so what is the process like? So how big a team are we talking about, roughly speaking? And what's the day like for when you were a briefer? Like, what time did you have to be at the office in the morning?
Earlier
or the night
than
before?
People should be up. I was going to say, now I'd say I would get to the office at the time some people are going to sleep. Yeah. I'll answer the question as to how the PDB is written really briefly, because I did used to write PDBs. And so the PDB process, goes through, it's written by the intelligence community. So post 9/11, post the reforms that we had in the intelligence community in 2004, the DNI took over the PDB process. Right. And I think so much goodness has come out of that. I think, I think we, the intelligence community, always tried to make sure that all the voices were heard. But, if one organization is writing it and another is writing something else, that was some, I think, of what was seen in the 9/11 Commission report is maybe everyone wasn't talking, even though I am a post 9/11 hire, so I can't speak to that. When I came in, I thought we were really doing a pretty good job of talking to one another. But it allows for this space where everyone has a say, and it's very transparent to the policymaker. And so, for example, if there is a great dissent in the PDB or in the analysis, one organization can say, hey, I've seen the same information or the same intelligence, and I think that this is actually what's going on. And that way, it makes sure that everyone is happy. It makes sure that the information gets out there.
Sure. And so you get there in the middle of the night.
Yes, back to my timeline. Sometimes I think about it and I can't believe it actually did that for 14 months. So when I was a briefer, I would get up. When I first started, somewhere between, 11 and 12 o'clock p.m., 11 p.m. and midnight. Right. I'd get up. I would, get out of the house by about 1 o'clock. Great thing about being a PDB briefer on those hours, no traffic in Washington.
I mean, even on the George Washington Parkway.
Even on the George Washington Parkway. And fantastic parking at the agency.
So. I imagine.
Not a lot of people going there at that point in time. So when I first started, I had this great trainer. And I'll give you a few analogies before I get back into the timeline of what it's like to be a briefer. Yeah. One thing I heard was, it's like trying to get up to speed on 17 different soap operas at once. So basically, when you're a new briefer, you walk in and there, as you kind of alluded to, there's so much activity going on in the world, and there's analytic lines for each of those. And you have to come up to speed on what those analytic lines are. And then as they change, you have to keep track. So once you are, once you've been in there for a while, you get very good at being able to follow the analysis, but learning them all at once is like a fire hose. Sure. Since we're on, a better piece, and this is the U.S. Army War College, I will say that I always tell my students here that anyone that tells you that there isn't a job where you will read 100 pages a night after the War College has never been a PDB briefer. So
I'll make sure to mention that the next time somebody complains about their Thucydides assignments.
Please do. Also mastering the content of about 20 graduate level essays on several unrelated foreign policy issues. Then this is done within about 3 hours, every night, 5 to 6 nights a week, distilling everything into a 15 to 30-minute briefing. Mm-hmm. So I would come in, I would be at work around 2 a.m., and I'd start by combing through all the intelligence reporting that analysts across the IC flagged to me. And so I got a good sense of what my customers' portfolios looked like. And so I would look at both the intelligence as well as the finished intelligence that was produced over the last 24 hours. That would take maybe an hour or two. So that's where this, kind of 100 pages comes into play. And I mean, as a War College graduate myself, I really learned how to do some strategic reading. And so to know if the title alone was enough to say, this isn't something that my customer is going to be interested in, or whether it was like, oh no, I need to read this word for word. Yeah. And when I say I'm selecting it, this isn't the PDB itself, the main, articles. This is everything that goes behind that. So when you ask, does every PDB customer get the same thing? They all get the PDB, but then depending on their position, their policies, they will get several additional articles, sometimes raw intelligence, sometimes longer pieces, things to help them get ready for their upcoming visits with other customers or other foreign partners, for example.
Sure.
And so that's really that's really what we're looking for as a PDB briefer when we say we're combing through the intelligence to see what else we can add and how else can we be of value. Sure. By about 4 a.m., I usually had everything that I needed to share with my customers, so I'd start rehearsing what I wanted to say during the briefing, and I'd type up my talking points. And you asked, how do you fit everything into a page or 2 pages? Yeah. You don't, right? And so around 5 a.m., we will have all of the authors of the PDBs, as well as some of the other high-priority intelligence reports, come up to us in the PDB spaces and brief us. We call that briefing the briefer.
Right.
And so basically, they would come up and they would give us a very high-level 30-second elevator brief of their piece. But then they would say, okay, now here's what isn't in the piece. Here's what didn't make it. Now, that's all coordinated through the intelligence community as well. So that's not their opinion. That's the analysis. And they would give us that typically both in writing as a background note as well as verbally so that we could then ask questions like, for example, when I was the Secretary of Defense's briefer, I might ask a question on how is this activity that's happening in this country going to affect what the secretary is going to speak on next week or something like that. So remembering that intelligence, we don't make policy, we inform policy. And so I always said being a briefer, when I did my interview, I said, why do you want to be a briefer is the question. And I said, well, the briefing is the nexus of intelligence and policy. Mm-hmm. And I think that is just fascinating. And it is kind of for an analyst that job where, one, it's amazing to think of being in the secretary's office every day,
for sure,
for months on end, but it's really where you can take all of that great work that the intelligence community and kind of be that voice. Yeah. And so it's less about what your expertise is. I mean, certainly all briefers have a level of expertise, but it's less about the expertise and more about making sure you have well-informed policymakers.
Well, I see, and that gets to an interesting question of the way that different individual policymakers choose to receive their brief. Mm-hmm. And how do you as the briefer have to adapt? I know that some folks like to read their brief while the briefer sits there quietly to answer questions. Some people are, I don't have time to read this, right? Give me the rundown. Mm-hmm. In your experience, what was most common, and were there some principals who it might change from day to day how they wanted their PDB?
yes to all those. Or the War College answer, it depends.
It depends. I like that. That's
so
right.
in my experience, I would have everything ready for my briefing around 6 a.m. And when I had the deputy secretary and USDI, it was very structured. So I would leave around 6:15. And let me tell you, also with traffic and driving, the best way to go to the Pentagon is with a driver who would drop you off right outside the E-ring.
That's right. Everybody should aspire to be able to have a driver to take them to the Pentagon and drop them off at the river entrance to go to the E-ring, right?
It was really
I bet it was really nice.
And so I had two customers that were so, they were just such voracious intelligence customers that I had 30 minutes one-on-one with each every day. And they wanted a briefing. And that isn't to say they didn't read some, but as we would go through the book, as it's called, I would deliver the bottom line. I'd give them a roadmap. I'd give them the critical sourcing that they might need to hear on that. And they would ask questions. It was really a conversation, which I loved. But as you mentioned, there are some who also just like to read and then, have their briefer respond to questions. I think one of the things that the PDB staff, at least in my experience and from talking to other friends who've been there before and after, do a great job of matching personalities. So just like any other business, I always say intelligence is a relationship business. It's all about making those relationships, building that trust. And I think that the staff does a really good job of matching those personalities, which is why I would have loved to have briefed the vice president, and I think that would have been great.
I'm sure.
But I also think the people that were selected for me to brief, that was really a good matchup. And it was just really such a great, enjoyable experience.
So are you allowed to leave the briefing with the principal, or are you expected to take it with you? I'm trying to think of this for people who don't understand intelligence work. Like, do you show up with the briefing in a briefcase that is handcuffed to your wrist, and you're required to take it back with you so that it can be filed and or destroyed upon your return to the agency? How does that work physically?
So I will say that the PDB is all traceable. So whether that's a hard copy or a soft copy, like on a tablet, for example, everything is checked in and checked out. So yes, when I first started, I would go down with, 2 or 3 copies, and I would go and I would show them. So we'd sit at the table, and we would each read over the book together, right? And then I would take it, put it back in my briefcase, go to the next one, open it. I was able to leave it there to be locked up overnight if necessary. If there's, for example, an article that, we didn't get to, or the secretary or USDI said, no, you know what, I'm not, I really need to dig into that one more. Could you leave it? Or I have some questions. So yes, you could do that both with a paper or a tablet copy. Right. But yes, they were signed out to you in your name. So you wanted to make sure those got back to where they belonged always.
I can always imagine this. So I know there's only so much you can tell about anything with regard to your job, Stephanie, but can you tell us about one of your favorite experiences or particular experiences that stick in your mind about being a briefer?
Sure. So one of the amazing opportunities about being a briefer is being able to travel with the president's trip. So the president typically would take a briefer with them. And again, as it is with the PDB, it changes from administration to administration. So some presidents have always taken the same briefers. Like some presidents have had multiple briefers and someone always travels. Others are more than happy to have a travel briefer, which is someone who is on the PDB briefing staff who travels with them on a trip. And so I got to go on Air Force One a few times, which was fantastic. I got to go on one trip down to Mar-a-Lago. And then I got to go overseas, which was a lot of fun, to England and Ireland.
As the SecDef's briefer, or
so this is actually as on the president's trip.
On the president's trip, yeah.
So I did not have the honor of meeting the president. I think that would have been also a really great experience. But I did have the opportunity to brief several members of cabinet, which was just great. They were also all really, really interested in intelligence and what we had to say. And again, I think for the most part, they all took the briefing a little bit differently. So that was probably the most fun and challenging part of being a travel briefer is, you're used to your customer. You're used to that tempo, how they like to hear their briefing, you can kind of anticipate maybe what they're going to ask. But with this trip, I think I briefed 10 people on the cabinet and staff. Everyone was different.
That's interesting. And so that's a long morning, though, if you have to brief 10 people, right?
Well, so it wasn't just a long morning. It was like several days, right? So I probably briefed 2 or 3 each day, maybe 4 or 5. And yeah, so some took 15 minutes, some read, one was an hour. And I mean, they just, again, were so interested in what the intelligence community, had to provide, because I think that, there just is there's a real respect for the intelligence community and what we have to provide. Also a respect for what the limitations of the intelligence community. And so it was just, that was absolutely one of my favorites.
Right. Well, for most non-specialist listeners to this podcast, right, people who are interested in history, intelligence policymaking, right? The most famous presidential daily brief is August 6th, 2001, right? Bin Laden determined to attack the United States. And the story is the president received his brief at his ranch in Crawford. And when it was over, he said good-naturedly to his briefer, okay, you've covered your fill in blank here, day's over. Now, leaving aside all controversies around that, because who could know exactly what's going to happen. The reason why that sticks in so many people's minds is because there seems to be this, oh my gosh, there was this dot that could have been connected, and why wasn't it connected? But I think it gets to a larger question of how do you, as somebody who makes the presidential daily brief, imagine how this intelligence is supposed to inform strategic decision making? Is how do we think about the connection between the PDB and policy? Because it can't be a matter of the president hears something in the morning at the PDB and picks up the phone and says, oh my gosh, we have to completely change our foreign policy. I just learned something new. But at the same time, right, should we imagine the idea of the PDB or the idea of strategic intelligence generally as a sort of a cumulative process of educating the principals so that they begin to see patterns that they can talk about later on? How do you see your responsibility within this larger question of the other places where principals might receive strategic intelligence?
Yeah, I think that I think it's really important to remember that intelligence is just one piece of the puzzle. And so there's an old adage, and I can never remember where it comes from, that there are policy successes and intelligence failures, right? And, obviously as an intelligence officer, I'd like to disagree with that. I'd like to think that intelligence informs policy, and sometimes, I don't even want to say sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. I think it's more about here's what the intelligence is telling us. And it's not just one piece. It's not just one report. It's the cumulative effect of everything that we know about that topic. And so I think that if we remember that intelligence is only one part of the puzzle and that it is sometimes wrong, the intelligence is sometimes wrong. You might have somebody feeding you information that you think is correct that isn't, for example. Or maybe you don't analyze it correctly. That is absolutely a possibility. But I don't think it's about covering yourself at all. I think it's more about making sure the right information gets in front of the right people at the right time. And I think more than anything, for that collaboration, not only within the intelligence community, but between the policymakers and the intelligence community. And so I think, like you said, getting to know, as a briefer, I'll say, getting to know your customers' policy initiatives, what they're working on, I think that really can help you inform them, again, without politicizing, without saying, hey, we're not going to cherry pick intelligence that supports a policy or that refutes a policy. And I think that's a really important thing to note as well. PDB briefers, intelligence community, we are very apolitical. Right. And so we are trying our very best to give fact-based or, I guess, intelligence-informed analysis, regardless of what the policy is. Right. That's kind of a long answer.
No, it's a very sensible answer.
Yeah, and I think when you think about crises as well, that's a little different. When people will say, well, why didn't we stop 9/11? Everything was there. But it's not just that everything has to be there. The dots do have to be connected. And I think that they can be connected in different ways. I think people, and again, I'm a post 9/11 hire, so this is just
Right.
me as a newspaper reading person. I think as an educated citizen, I would say that, reading the 9/11 Commission, for example, there were a lot of things that the intelligence community knew from what it looked like. There was a lot that they didn't know.
Right.
And so I think I'll probably leave it at that, only because
Sure.
I wasn't, involved heavily in that.
Well, and it's the biggest problem is that even the most accurate intelligence is not going to suddenly make you clairvoyant.
That's right.
You're not going to magically know what's going to happen tomorrow. Right. We're still trying to make educated guesses, and intelligence is there to educate us. One of the things that educates us, and so the role of the PDB is to make sure that the people making policy decisions have at least the best information we can provide to them on a given morning.
Absolutely. I think it's best to convey what we know, and I think it's equally, if not sometimes more important, to convey what we don't know. And I think that's another thing that really plays into how intelligence is received, is making sure we inform policymakers of what gaps are out there.
And to be brave enough to say that,
Yes.
which is always a challenge.
To be brave enough even to say, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I would get a lot of questions when I was a PDB briefer, and oftentimes I was well prepared by, hard work, but also very much by the support system. I mean, we say PDB briefers are jack of all trades, masters of none. I would argue we're all masters of, again, something. I was a missile analyst, for example, but I am not an economist. And, there would be a piece in the PDB about economy. I'm not going to know the ins and outs of that, but I know that whoever wrote that piece is going to give me the best background, best information, best preparation they possibly can, so that I can make sure that my customer is well informed.
There you go. And creating informed customers is also what we do here at A Better Peace. And so I hope that we've informed our customers today about what goes into the Presidential Daily Brief. Stephanie Sellers, thanks for joining us today on A Better Peace to talk about your work.
Thank you, Ron. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure to have you here. And thanks to all of you for listening in. Please send us your comments on this program and all the programs. Send us your suggestions for future programs. We're always interested in hearing from you. Now that you have been informed by this intelligent conversation, we hope that you'll come back to join us for future conversations. And we'll be here to welcome you at A Better Peace. And so until next time, from the War Room, I'm Ron Granieri.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.